My name is Valerie Vetter and welcome to the Aftering radio show, Mortality and Us. On today's programme, learning about the old traditions around death and funerals in Ireland. I got the chance to visit the incredible National Folklore Collection located in UCD, where I got to speak to its director.
My name is Críostóir Mac Cárthaigh. I'm the director of the National Folklore Collection, based here in UCD. The collection here, much of it is the work of the Irish Folklore Commission. The commission was established in 1935 by the government with the task of recording, preserving and publishing Irish folklore. And in the initial years they focused a lot on Gaeltacht-speaking districts, because the feeling was that a lot of customs and traditions were likely to disappear along with the language, and the language was in serious decline at that stage. They focused quite a lot in the western districts, and that changed by the 40s. They began to record elsewhere. One gap in the collection we have perceived was the urban experience, if you like. They tended to focus a lot on the rural Ireland. It was kind of thinking being, well, folklore is a rural thing, a phenomenon. Of course, that wasn't the case. In the case, for instance, regarding death, and it's one of the questions you were asking about, funeral customs, there's a marked similarity, throughout Ireland, a consistency in relation to death, and the whole range of customs and traditions surrounding it. Urban and rural are no different.
Really?
In that respect, yeah. In the basics, in rural Ireland, there may be more traditions of, for instance, the immediate family or neighbours digging the grave. That doesn't happen in the bigger cities. Certainly, it's more formalised and institutionalised, but the pattern overall is the same.
I suppose you think of keening quite a lot when you go back in time. Was that something that ever existed in the cities? Well,
we don't have records of that, but I don't see why it wouldn't, because it was very general throughout Ireland, both in the case of informal keening, and there was a point where there were such things as professional keeners, women who were noted for keening, and they would have been paid something, or given some token, and it was an important element of the whole funeral procession and the whole ritual of surrounding death.
Because you very much think of wakes being something that happens both in rural and urban life. Because that tradition is even having resurgence today.
That's right.
Maybe you could explain a bit about that.
Yes, the wake is a very, very important aspect of it, and this is the idea of keeping a vigil over the dead person, and this idea is related to, it's essentially a Christian idea. The idea of the soul is enabled to depart the body in the right way, in the right circumstances, and but also being guarded against the supernatural to some degree, because there's a mix of folk ideas about what happens to people after they die. In some cases, in an awful lot of cases, there are stories about people who died apparently, but were then seen in Fairyland, in the other world. Somebody happens to, at night time, happens to come across somebody who died. But there was this idea that in certain cases, often, especially young women and young people generally, but right across, that they were a society, that they were abducted by the fairies.
Post-mortem, their soul was taken.
Well, before they died, they actually were abducted. So, and that there's simply a physical semblance of them left behind. So there's a lot of stories about that, and that's where Christianity and, folk belief, there's a certain crossover between the two, a huge amount of tradition and custom and practice that derives not from Christianity but from just folk practice, and probably very, very old. Like in Ireland, the amount of ritual surrounding death is compared to a lot of other countries in Europe is quite massive. This is our reading room here, Valerie, and I'm just showing you here what we call the Bible, a handbook of Irish folklore. Now, this was produced in 1942. However, it's a very good guide to the range of customs and traditions that one could expect. And if you turn to, in Ireland, it's a guidebook for collectors, effectively.
What do you mean by collectors?
By folklore collectors. So the Commission employed full-time and part-time collectors, and this was a manual for them, in effect, what to record, the different aspects. And if we look at this, sickness, death, the whole range of traditions that... So, for instance, starting here with the personification of death. How was death regarded by people? Was it personified? You know, what form did it take? A human, animal, bird, cloud, smell, darkness? What terminology was applied to death? And phrases such, you know, on his last legs, Inochtun Vosh, Tokadun Vos, and you know, gasping and so on, and that. Death omens. What about death omens? Where sounds heard, were things seen in advance. We often think of course, the Banshee as the death messenger who announces the death. And in Irish tradition, after the Banshee, there's a Banshee follows certain families, typically those with Gaelic names, with an O or a Mac in the name. Now, I think that aspect of the Banshee, element of the Banshee tradition, would have perhaps arisen in the 17th century. You know, when you got large-scale plantation of Ireland, and that would have helped distinguish the native Gaelic from the incomer. And part of that was, well, you know, the supernatural death messenger, you know, the Gaels have their supernatural death messenger.
And at the beginning you referred to the fairies and then them capturing people. Is there the Banshee and fairies, do they overlap at all, or are they completely different?
They're different. I mean, what they distinguishes the Banshee is that she's a lone figure, connected, and can be quite malevolent, you know, so you were warned not to interfere with her. But she personifies death and the approach of death.
So she's the Grim Reaper, if you think about it.
In
is
many,
that right?
yes,
Okay.
a good analogy. The fairies are you know, a collective otherworld group of beings, and you know, they look like you and I. You know, have similar practices, but they occupy another dimension.
Are they small?
No.
See, that's the thing. You know the way in kind of cartoons and all this. So fairies aren't small at all.
The majority of descriptions are that they are similar in size to us, and that the idea of them abducting mortals, humans, is obviously part of that. You know, so there's no physically distinguishing features between us and the fairies as such. Yes, you do find occasions where people talk about, you know, a small little person having diminutive size and so on.